Hello, Medicos. Good day to all of you. This is Dr. BK for you. And in today's session, we will be learning about the basal nuclei. So, now, with respect to today's topic, the basal nuclei, our learning objectives will be a short introduction about the basal nuclei. Then, what all structures, that is the component parts of the basal nuclei, what forms the completely the basal nuclei. Then, what are all the subdivisions of the basal nuclei? And then, more importantly, we will be discussing about the afferent and efferent connections of the basal nuclei. Then, I will try to list out the functions of the basal nuclei and then conclude with the clinical aspects. Then we will also see one more short topic, that is the third ventricle. So with respect to third ventricle, we will discuss about the situation, boundaries, and then the mainly your choroid plexus and its communications of the third ventricle. Now, first of all, coming to the basal nuclei. So here you are able to see mass of gray matter, which is somewhat tail-shaped, and then roughly it is egg-shaped or a biconvex lens-shaped. So these are actually the nucleus, which is situated deep within the telencephalon. So they are subcortical because they are present below the cerebral cortex. Okay, so deep nuclei which are subcortical in position are actually called as the basal nuclei, and the old term refers to them as the basal ganglia. Okay, so the whole cerebral hemisphere is actually developed from the telencephalon. So naturally what happens is these are also present within the cerebral hemisphere, so they are developed from the telencephalon. Okay, ganglia refers to a term which is collection of neurons outside the brain or central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. So outside the brain and spinal cord, you consist mainly the ganglia. We actually call those collections of neurons or nerve bodies as the ganglia. So one good example is the trigeminal ganglia, which is situated in the floor of the skull, middle cranial fossa. You can see that. Same way, immediately outside the spinal cord, the dorsal roots entering the spinal cord, the dorsal roots of the spinal nerve, they also form a ganglia which is called as the dorsal root ganglia. So mostly the sensory ganglia, they are made up of pseudo unipolar neurons. Okay, whereas you call it as the motor ganglia. So they are mainly made up of multipolar neurons. So you have mainly your sympathetic ganglia and your parasympathetic ganglia, like your ciliary, aortic ganglia, pterygopalatine, submandibular ganglia. They are all motor ganglia. Okay. Now, to put it very briefly, they actually indirectly influence the motor neurons. That is the cerebral cortex, the motor neurons arising from the cerebral cortex. So those neurons, they send some feedback information to the cerebral cortex. So that is to your sensory motor areas. Not only that, directly also they can influence the motor neurons, mainly through the effect over them through the midbrain and the brainstem, especially the midbrain and pons through the reticular formation. So through that also they can influence the alpha and gamma motor neurons, which are traveling to the spinal cord. So their main function is for the smooth performance of the voluntary muscle activity. Okay, so voluntary muscle activity, with the accuracy and smooth performance, this is necessary. So they form a very much an essential part of your extra pyramidal system. So the pyramidal tract mainly consists of the corticospinal tract, one of the major descending tract arising from the cerebral cortex, and through the descending tracts to the spinal cord, and from there through the spinal nerves. And also what happens is they mainly also through the corticonuclear fibers through the cranial nerves, they bring about the voluntary muscle movements, the pyramidal system. So they are responsible for the movements, but programming these movements and the smooth conduction of the movement is mainly by the extra pyramidal system, that is the descending fibers. Mainly your rubrospinal fibers, tectospinal fibers, vestibulospinal fibers. So these are all the descending tracts, which also what happens is they indirectly influence the muscle activity. So they bring about coordinated muscle movements. And here you should also remember one more thing. One of the major part in bringing up the smooth coordination of the muscle movements is, again, you also have the contribution from the cerebellum also, because cerebellum also what happens, sends information to the cerebral cortex. So this is all constantly providing information to the cerebral cortex about the muscular activity through its feedback loop. Okay, so that is we can put it in, that is actually in a nutshell what is the function of this basal nuclei. Now, we will come to the components of the basal nuclei. Mainly, it consists of the structural components. First, we will see what are the anatomical structures which are actually involved, or what are the parts we can actually classify them under the basal nuclei, or the subcortical mass of gray matter. So, mainly it consists of your caudate nucleus. So you're able to see a large comma shaped or C shaped nucleus, which is called as the caudate nucleus. And then little laterally you go, you have another mass of gray matter, which is called as the lentiform nucleus. So these both, they are actually called as the corpus striatum. Okay, so corpus means body, and striatum means striation. So in the voluntary muscle you come across in a microscopic view cross striations, no, so stripes or lines. So I will tell in a short while why it is called as corpus striatum. And then you have claustrum, of course, which is not shown in this picture. And then you have a small mass of round gray matter attached to this tail of the caudate nucleus, and that is called as the amygdaloid body or amygdaloid nucleus. So that amygdaloid body is mainly is your hippocampal formation. So then functionally, apart from the corpus striatum, mainly your corpus, mainly your caudate and lentiform nucleus, this claustrum and amygdaloid body, they are only structurally related to this basal nuclei, but not functionally. So functionally, what all we can include mainly in the corpus, along with the corpus striatum, is your subthalamic nucleus and some fibers present there, subthalamus region. And then you have to definitely include the substantia nigra. Okay, and then your red nucleus. So these things you can see mainly if you take a section of the brain, mostly a coronal section, you are able to see the caudate nucleus, and then you are able to see the lentiform nucleus, which has got two parts, which we are going to see in shortly. We are going to discuss about this globus pallidus and putamen, which forms a part of the lentiform nucleus. Okay, and then as I told you, we should include the midbrain, substantia nigra, and your red nucleus and superior colliculus. And here you are able to see the thalamus, and below that ventral in front and ventral part, and to the lateral to the thalamus, you will see the subthalamic nucleus. Also, we should include. So naturally, this mass of gray matter, subcortical mass of gray matter, and the surrounding regions, that is your part of your midbrain and your subthalamus, all are functionally grouped under this basal nuclei, because it has reciprocal afferent and efferent connections with these areas. So with this short introduction and the component parts of the basal nuclei, now we will try to understand the anatomy mainly of the corpus striatum. So, as I told you, the corpus striatum mainly consists of your caudate nucleus, and then you are able to see the lentiform nucleus, and they both are actually separated by this structure. You know, this band of white matter, which is called as the internal capsule, which is your anterior limb, genu, and then the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So, I think, hope you all have actually read thoroughly about the internal capsule and the various fibers, ascending and descending fibers present in the various parts, that is your anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolentiform and sublentiform part of the internal capsule, because it is very important to know the distribution of fibers. So especially your posterior limb mainly consists of uh, your corticospinal fibers, no, which passes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and more importantly, the blood supply also you should know about the internal capsule. So coming back to this corpus striatum, as I told you, caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus. So the lentiform means it is like a lens shape, which I showed you in the previous picture. So how actually the lentiform nucleus, it is like a biconvex lens, but here when you look at it in a section, mainly you are able to see it is somewhat triangular in shape, and mainly it consists of two parts. The lateral part is actually called as the putamen, and the medial part is actually called as the globus pallidus. Okay, so the medial part is globus pallidus, and the lateral part is actually called as the putamen. Okay, so now why you should understand it is called as the corpus striatum, because the caudate nucleus, especially the anterior part, okay, anterior part of the caudate nucleus is connected to the lateral part of the lentiform nucleus, because they both actually form one single unit. They function as one single unit, that is your caudate nucleus and the lateral part of lentiform nucleus, that is your putamen. Okay, and they are called as striatum, and they also belong to the neostriatum, so part of the neocortex. That is why it is called as the neostriatum. Okay, so these two, what happens, there are fibers connecting these two, which passes through the internal capsule, because internal capsule is intervening between the caudate nucleus, which is present medial to the internal capsule, and lentiform nucleus is present lateral to the internal capsule. So these both will be connected by fibers, bands of gray matter, which passes through the internal capsule, and that gives a striated appearance, striped appearance, and that is why it is actually called as the striatum. So corpus striatum, that is caudate nucleus, and the putamen forms the neostriatum. So the medial part, globus pallidus, forms your pallidiostriatum. So the medial part or the globus pallidus, that forms your paleostriatum. So the other parts like your subthalamus and your amygdaloid forms your archistriatum. So most oldest part is actually the archistriatum, no? Part of your olfactory cortex and limbic system are actually archistriatum. Okay, then you also have something called as the ventral striatum, because in front of this caudate and lentiform nucleus, in front and below, you have certain nucleus which has similar connections like that of this caudate and lentiform nucleus, and that is why it is called as ventral striatum. So that includes your nucleus accumbens and your olfactory tubercle. Okay, so nucleus accumbens and olfactory tubercle, they are situated close to your anterior perforated substance. So I'm not going into much details of this nucleus accumbens and the olfactory tubercle, because these actually, what happens is the hippocampus mainly projects to this nucleus accumbens. Okay, and also your olfactory and entorhinal areas and your amygdaloid complex. So all these are sending afferent fibers. The nucleus accumbens receives fibers from your what happens, your hippocampus, cingulate gyrus, okay, entorhinal cortex, okay, all these, okay, and amygdaloid, as you told, because the basal nuclei, if you look at carefully, and I told you planning and programming of the voluntary muscle, which it influences through two ways. A direct pathway is there and indirect pathway is there. Okay, apart from that, you can also come across, it is having connections with the base, that is the basal nuclei, with the limbic system. So that means it is also concerned with memory and rewarding. Okay, so the rewarding activities. So that is also one of the functions of this basal nuclei. So ventral striatum mainly seen in your olfactory areas, and you also have something called as a ventral pallidum. That is, when you look at this globus pallidus, the lower part, what happens is crossed by the anterior commissure. Okay, so it will be crossed by the anterior commissure. So thereby, some part of the globus pallidus is detached below the anterior commissure as the ventral pallidum. Okay, so these two parts are also discussed, but not much in detail about this ventral striatum or the pallidum. Okay, now coming to the now we have understood the components, the structural and the functional components. Coming to the caudate nucleus, the structure of the caudate nucleus, it is coma shaped or C-shaped mass of gray matter, and it consists of mainly your head, body, and then the tail. So that is the parts of the caudate nucleus: head, body, and tail. And what is attached to the tail is the amygdaloid body or amygdaloid nucleus. This is more intimately related to your hippocampus, that is your limbic system. Okay, so now if you carefully observe this caudate nucleus, and laterally what you are able to see is the lentiform nucleus, and the head is in direct contact with the lateral part of the lentiform nucleus, that is your putamen, and medial part will form the globus pallidus. So along its attachment, the internal capsule is passing in between, and mass of gray matter actually traverse the internal capsule connecting the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So that is why it is called as the corpus striatum. Okay, so now if you intimately carefully examine this caudate nucleus, see, it is intimately related to this cavity of the telencephalon called as the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle, this part is central part of the lateral ventricle, this space, central part of the cavity of the lateral ventricle. The cavity shows extensions. In this you are able to see posterior extension or posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, which is extending into the occipital lobe. Then you are able to see the cavity shows an extension as inferior horn into the temporal lobe, and more anteriorly you have an anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so lateral ventricle we will be discussing in the next lecture. So first I told you it is situated around the lateral ventricle, and the head forms the floor of the anterior ventricle. Okay, and body actually is forming the central part, floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle, and tail is in the roof of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so tail forms the roof of the inferior horn, body forms the floor of the central part, and the head forms the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, and medial to the caudate nucleus you are able to see that is the thalamus. Okay, that is actually called as the thalamus. So now you are able to see this caudate nucleus is actually medially related to the thalamus. So that is actually called as the thalamus. And what separates the your caudate nucleus from the thalamus is your thalamostriate vein and your stria terminalis. So you will be able to see a band stria terminalis on the thalamus. Okay, so the nucleus is related to thalamus medially, and this is the posterior part or pulvinar of the thalamus, where you will have the uh, your medial and lateral geniculate body, and from the inferior horn temporal lobe, the hippocampal and fiber tracts of the hippocampus coming out as the fornix, column of fornix, and they will form the commissure of the fornix. Okay, so now let us not go into those details much. Okay, so here when you look at it, the caudate nucleus is actually separated from the thalamus by the thalamostriate vein and the stria terminalis. So as I told you in the last picture, we have seen the amygdaloid body is attached to the tail of the caudate nucleus. So now coming to the lentiform nucleus, as I told you, it is like a biconvex lens when you look it as a whole structure. But in the sections, it appears triangular in shape. So it consists of two parts. The lateral part is actually called as the putamen and part of the neocortex, whereas this globus pallidus is a part of the paleocortex. So it is triangular or wedge shaped in sections, and it is related medially to the internal capsule. Okay, so it is related medially to the internal capsule. So you are able to say anterior limb genu and posterior limb of the internal capsule, which separates this lentiform nucleus from the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Okay, now if you look at it, the your putamen and the globus pallidus are separated by a band called as the external medullary lamina. Okay, so the mainly your globus pallidus and putamen are separated by a external medullary lamina. Okay, now the globus pallidus is again separated by the internal medullary lamina into medial and lateral parts. Okay, this globus pallidus itself has got a medial part and a lateral part. So I will just show it in the next picture. So here you are able to see, so the lateral part is actually called as the putamen, and this is your globus pallidus. There is a line that is called as the external medullary lamina. The globus pallidus again has got a medial and lateral parts, which is separated by the internal medullary lamina. So medially, I told you it is related to the internal capsule, which separates the lentiform nucleus from the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Okay, so which separate it from the thalamus, you are able to see here, and more anteriorly you will see the caudate nucleus. Above it is related to the corona radiata. So above it is related to the corona radiata, and below it will be related to the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So what passes through the sublentiform part of the internal capsule? Your auditory radiations from your medial geniculate body to the auditory cortex. Okay, so mainly, so laterally it is related to the external capsule, and above, as I told you, to the corona radiata, and laterally it is related to the external capsule, and then you have a band of gray matter called as the claustrum. Okay, claustrum, and then you will see mainly the insular cortex more laterally. Okay, so you will see the insular cortex. So below, as I told you, it is related to the sublentiform part. The lentiform nucleus, it is related to the sublentiform part of the internal capsule below, above corona radiata. Laterally, it is related to the claustrum. Okay, so the claustrum actually is separated from the lentiform nucleus by the external capsule. So here you are able to see the lentiform nucleus, and that is the claustrum, and between these two what you see is the external capsule, that is the external capsule. Lateral to the claustrum you are able to see that is the insula or the hidden cortex. So claustrum is a thin strip of gray matter which you are able to see here, and so present lateral to the lentiform nucleus and separated from it by the external capsule. So the exact function of the claustrum is not known. We don't know what is the exact function, and the laterally it is related to the insula and separated from the insula by again a band of white matter. Okay, so the exact function of the claustrum is not known. So next structure, we have finished about the caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, anatomical structures, components of the basal nuclei we are dealing, claustrum, and then finally coming to the amygdaloid body. So you are able to see here related to the tail of the caudate nucleus is a small round mass of gray matter which is called as the amygdaloid body or amygdaloid nucleus. So it is situated in the temporal lobe, so deep to the uncus, in the uncus of the temporal lobe. The hook-like structure you see in the inferior surface of the temporal lobe is the uncus. So deep within that you see this amygdaloid body. So mainly again it has connections with your hippocampus, because the parahippocampal gyrus you are able to see here more intimately related to it. So it produces visceral responses based on your stimuli. Okay, so it produces visceral response to the environmental stimuli. So mainly such as increase in heart rate and pupillary dilatations. So more influenced by your emotions. Okay, so more influenced by your emotions. Okay, and functionally it is related to the limbic system, but structurally it is under the corpus striatum or basal nuclei, caudate nucleus to the tail it is attached. So that is why we are actually discussing it here. Next, coming to the functional components, we should include, as I told you, the subthalamus. Other than that, your red nucleus and substantia nigra, we have discussed in the brainstem lecture class itself, midbrain. Okay, so the subthalamic nucleus, as I told you, it consists of the nucleus accumbens. This is your ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens, and the olfactory tubercle. The subthalamic nucleus is situated below, in front and lateral to the thalamus, is actually called as the subthalamic nucleus. Okay, now the subthalamic nucleus is also somewhat a biconvex lens, like a biconvex lens, and what happens is it medially it merges or encroaches upon the hypothalamus. Mainly it encroaches on the hypothalamus, and it is separated from the thalamic nuclei by the zona incerta. It is actually separated by the zona incerta. So it mainly projects to the pars reticularis of the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra has got pars compacta in the front and pars reticula behind. So I'm not going to more details of this. Just remember where the subthalamic nuclei is present. Now, the fibers in the subthalamic region is very important. Okay, so the fibers of the subthalamic region mainly consists of your ansa lenticularis and the fasciculus lenticularis. So here you are able to see the fasciculus lenticularis and ansa lenticularis. So this is your globus pallidus and your putamen, your lentiform nucleus and the thalamus here. So some fibers are actually what happens is they pass through the thalamus. They pass to the thalamus via this internal capsule, or some wind around the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So they are actually called as this the ansa lenticularis and fasciculus lenticularis. So they connect the globus pallidus and the thalamus through the subthalamic region. Okay, so they mainly connect through the subthalamic region. So that is called as the ansa lenticularis, and other one is the fasciculus lenticularis. Okay, they form actually the thalamic fasciculus. They form the thalamic fasciculus because these are joined by the dentato-rubrothalamic fibers. So dentatothalamic from the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum, and rubrothalamic from the red nucleus. So now you are able to understand what would be the function of this basal nuclei. So thereby it all forms your extrapyramidal system, which is concerned with the smooth functioning of the voluntary muscle activity. So extrapyramidal system. Okay, so apart from that ansa lenticularis and fasciculus lenticularis, you also have a subthalamic fasciculus. Okay, so that is between your ansa and then your what do you call, this is your ansa and fasciculus lenticularis. Here you have the subthalamic fasciculus, which has connections with your globus pallidus and the subthalamic nucleus. Okay, so as I told you, thalamic fasciculus is ansa and fasciculus lenticularis joining with the dentatothalamic and rubrothalamic to project to the thalamus. Okay, so apart from that, the other connections are also to the midbrain. You are able to see here from the globus pallidus. We will come to it later after some time. So now connections of the basal nuclei. So coming to the connections of the basal nucleus, to put it in a very simple terms, is it receives mainly fibers from the cerebral cortex and from the substantia nigra. It is projected to the putamen. So all the fibers from the caudate nucleus and to the putamen it is projected. Okay, so whatever the input from the putamen, what happens is the fibers actually travel to the globus pallidus. Okay, so from here actually it travels to the globus pallidus. Okay, now the efferents coming out of the globus pallidus actually go to the thalamus and thereby influence the sensory motor cortex. Okay, so globus pallidus efferents to the sensory motor cortex. So not only that, it has a direct connections with the subthalamic nucleus. You are able to see here direct connections with the subthalamic nucleus. Okay, and globus pallidus through the reticular formation and nuclei in the brain stem pedunculopontine nucleus will influence directly the alpha and gamma motor neurons in the spinal cord through the reticular formation also. So very simply putting it, all efferents are received by the caudate nucleus and putamen. From there it projects to the globus pallidus. From the globus pallidus, the efferent fibers are actually projected to the different areas. Now, so this is to very simpler form, as I told you, because there are a lot of interconnections going on with the direct and indirect. So I'm not going into much of those details, because for undergraduate level those intricate details are not very much essential. So afferent connections, mainly when you look at the afferent connections, so the caudate nucleus and the putamen mainly receives afferents from your cerebral cortex. They are called as the corticostriate fibers. The corticostriate fibers, they receive mainly fibers from the pyramidal cells, motor cortex. They are glutamate, excitatory in nature. Okay, and they actually what happens is they project to the striatum. So that is your corticos, that is to the corpus striatum. Then they also receive fibers from other part of the cortex also, like from the hippocampus through the fornix. Okay, and also from the olfactory and entorhinal areas, they also receive fibers. Okay, they also receive also fibers from the premotor area and parietal lobe. Also, they receive fibers from the parietal lobe. So, all parts of the cortex. I'm not going into, as I told you, much details, because different part of the cerebral cortex, they project to different areas of this caudate nucleus and the putamen. Just remember, from the cortex to the caudate nucleus and putamen, that is the corpus striatum, it is the corticostriate fibers. Then from the thalamus, it is a thalamostriate fibers. This is mainly from the intralaminar nuclei. You have the internal medullary lamina, no, which divides the nucleus of the thalamus into medial group, anterior group, and the lateral group. So within the intralaminar nuclei and centromedian nuclei. So thalamostriate fibers. Okay, so they are also mainly excitatory in nature. They excite this corpus striatum. Okay, then apart from that, mainly dopamine from the substantia nigra. They are called as the nigrostriate fibers. Okay, now the dopamine, it is thought to release by two types of cells. You have a group A8 cells and A6 cells. Okay, so they have both type. Mainly the dopamine is inhibitory in nature, but it can influence or it can actually inhibit this caudate nucleus by two types of its projections. Okay, that is about the nigrostriate fibers. Okay, then next what you have is the serotogenic fibers from the nucleus ceruleus and noradrenergic fibers. So the noradrenergic fibers are from the reticular formation. So they all are thought to be mostly inhibitory, except for the corticostriate and the thalamostriate fibers. Corticostriate fibers, as I told you, they actually secrete glutamate as the neurotransmitters. Okay, neurotransmitters. Now, the prefrontal, the posterior, that is the parietal cortex, prefrontal, occipital, and the temporal cortex is actually not very clear what is this function. But the limbic and sensory motor and thalamic area, what happens? They provide cognitive information, mainly from your hippocampal formation, limbic system. Okay, and the thalamic afferents, they actually give cognitive information and affective information to this striatum. So this striatum in turn makes this information available to the cerebral cortex, which is going to project through the thalamus. Okay, so they will project to the cerebral cortex. So mainly to the supplementary motor areas, because there only what happens, the programming and memory is actually stored in the supplementary motor area only. It is stored. The motor area planning is not done, only the execution is done, but the planning is taking place there. So that is through the caudate nucleus, the supplementary motor area receives this information. Otherwise it is very difficult for the cortex to access this information. Okay, so all the efferents, corticostriate, thalamostriate, nigrostriate, and from the reticular formation and nucleus ceruleus, they project to the globus pallidus. Now, to the efferents. So, from the globus pallidus, mainly the efferents are, you are able to see this fasciculus lenticularis, ansa lenticularis. Through this ansa and fasciculus lenticularis, they project to the thalamus. So, mainly your ventral anterior and ventral nucleus of the thalamus. No, so through them they are projecting to the thalamus, and from the thalamus it goes to your sensory motor cortex. Sensory motor cortex. So that is the efferent fibers, globus pallidus. Then through the subthalamic fasciculus, they actually project to the subthalamus. Okay. So pallidial efferents mainly subthalamic fasciculus reach the subthalamic nucleus. Then they also reach to the pedunculopontine. Okay, so the pedunculopontine nucleus in the midbrain, and through that it actually what happens projects efferents to the pedunculopontine nucleus in the midbrain, to the thalamus via the ansa lenticularis and fasciculus lenticularis, and to the subthalamus via the subthalamic fasciculus, and pallidionigral fibers to the substantia nigra. So mainly to the pars reticularis of the substantia nigra. Now, one more thing you should remember here, the substantia nigra also receives fibers directly from the striatum, not from the globus pallidus, mainly from this striatum, caudate and the putamen. Directly they have also connections with the substantia nigra. Okay, so now if you look at the basic pathway. So summary of the basal nuclei connections, you see a direct pathway and indirect pathway. So the basic arrangement is the cerebral cortex mainly projects to the striatum. You are able to understand. So this striatum in turn projects to your globus pallidus. This is called as globus pallidus externum and internum. So it is actually projecting both to the externum and internum from the striatum. So this globus pallidus, what happens is in turn, what happens influence the supplementary motor area via the thalamus. So this is a direct loop pathway. Motor cortex, striatum, globus pallidus, thalamus, internum, and from there what happens? It goes to the motor cortex, influences the motor cortex. So to how to perform information about the muscle sensations and all those things it is actually giving. Now, okay, so what happens is they also influence indirectly. You are able to see the striatum, what happens as direct connections, as I told you, with the substantia nigra. Okay, to the substantia nigra there will be direct connections between the substantia nigra and the striatum, pars reticularis. Okay, pars reticularis. So these again what happens is to the internal nucleus, to the what do you call globus pallidus and substantia nigra, they will also influence uh, the gamma and alpha motor neurons. They influence the gamma and alpha motor neurons via the superior colliculus in the brainstem. Okay, via the superior colliculus in the brainstem. Through that they can influence. Okay, so now you are able to see here, these are all the inhibitory receptors, and what is given in the blue color is your excitatory receptors. So okay, now in the direct pathway, motor cortex send information to the striatum, and what happens is it will actually slow the inhibitory neurotransmitters from the striatum. See, thereby what happens? It excites the thalamus. Okay. Whereas in the indirect pathway, what happens is it is like a feedback mechanism. It has to stop the motor cortex from exciting. Okay. So it has to stop the motor cortex from the exciting, and that takes place through the subthalamic nucleus. So mainly through the substantia nigra and also through the subthalamic nucleus. So striatum to the subthalamic nucleus and substantia nigra directly to the striatum. Pars reticularis, I told you it projects. Okay, so that is about the summary of the basal nuclei connections. So mainly functions, as I told you, smooth coordination of the voluntary muscle movements. So programming and planning of the voluntary muscle movement. So it decides the range, power and speed of the muscle, individual muscle, how it has to be performed. So concerned with automatic associated movements, which maintenance. Example, when you walk, you actually swing your limbs, no? So that is called as automated associated movements. And maintenance of erect posture then decreases the muscle tone or maintains the muscle tone. Otherwise what happens, mainly lesions will produce hypertonia, whereas lesions of cerebellum will produce a hypotonia. Here basal nuclear lesion will increase the muscle tone. So mainly unwanted muscle movements, unwanted jerking and all those things. Involuntary movements, not involuntary muscles, voluntary muscles with involuntary movements. So it should be precise. So if you look at the basal nuclei lesions, if you ask the person to touch his point nose, tip of the nose with your finger, so naturally his movement will not be exactly and precise. So he will have tremors, and instead of touching the tip, his finger might go sideways, this ways and that ways. So all that shows mainly lesions of the basal nuclei. So it fixes the proximal joint. Thereby what happens is, it can perform maximum movement as the distal joint. Now for example, very good example is you have to semi-flexed elbow. So in the elbow joint it is semi-flexed. Then you can perform the pronation and supination effectively. Okay, you are screwing and unscrewing movements, no? Pronation and supination. In an extended elbow, you see the pronation and supination is not that much effective. So fixators, certain muscles, they fix the proximal joint, that is called as the fixators. And thereby when the fixators fix the proximal joint, the maximum movement efficiently the movements takes place at the distal joint. Then reflex muscular activity, and then movements responsible for emotional expression. So this it has connections with your limbic system. Okay, so that is the functions. Now coming to the clinical aspects. One most common clinical aspect is the Parkinsonism. So nigrostriate fibers. So from the substantia nigra, what happens is the fibers going to the corpus striatum, there is reduced secretion of dopamine. So this leads to a condition called as Parkinsonism. So mainly the inhibitory control of the corpus striatum is actually lost. Substantia nigra through its inhibitory neurotransmitters controls the corpus striatum. So this inhibitory control is lost, and we see a list of symptoms. So many symptoms we can see, mainly tremors, resting tremor. Even when the limb is resting, you can see mild tremors. Okay, then you come across the posture is stooping, so he is not straight. Maintenance of erect posture is not possible. And then mask like face and rigidity. You see a cogwheel rigidity, it is called as marked rigidity, mask like face, because expressions, emotional expressions are not there. Then you have a shuffling gait, slow and shuffling gait, he cannot walk briskly. And then pin rolling movement of the fingers, mainly in the fingers you can see pin rolling movement. So these are all symptoms of the Parkinsonism. So you know, one of the famous boxer Muhammad Ali was actually suffering from this disease. And I think his daughter is also, I'm not sure, also has inherited this Parkinsonism disease. So absence of associated movements. But nowadays treatment like L-dopa or synthetic dopamine is injected. Okay, so absence of associated movements, swinging of your arms is all absent in case of this disease. Now Mainly, if you look at the lesions of the basal nuclei, dyskinesia. So, kinesia is movement. Here, no paralysis. Movement is there, but dyskinesia. So, uncontrolled, unwanted movements. When it is very low, it is called as hypokinesia, and when it is slow, especially, and when rapid movements is called as hyperkinesia. So the hyperkinetic movements, mostly in what do you call hyperkinetic movements you see in basal nucleus. So chorea, athetosis, and balismus or balism. So these type of movements you can see. So first we will see mainly because the GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid reduced production, because corpus striatum to the pallidum, what happens, the GABA is actually secreted. So reduction in GABA, reduction in dopamine in the nigrostriate pathway. So lesion of striatonigral pathway. Again, you know the corpus striatum has reciprocal connections with the substantia nigra, to and fro connections. So mainly you come across chorea is quick jerky movements of limbs, face and tongue. So now you know the term choreography, from where actually it has originated. Okay, so quick movements of the face, limbs and tongue. So two types of chorea you come across. One is called as the Huntington's chorea. So it is an autosomal dominant disorder. Autosomal dominant disorder. So it is inherited, congenital. It is inherited. So what happens in case of Huntington's chorea is reduction in GABA producing neurons. So you have rapid jerky movements. Whereas a Sydenham's chorea, Sen-Whitus dance, it is called as, it is acquired. It might actually takes place. Most common condition is after a streptococcal infection, so rheumatic fever. So post rheumatic fever complications might occur. One is your Sydenham's chorea. Here, that is what, again antibodies are produced against your corpus striatum. Okay, and because of this, what happens is it is less rapid jerky movements, and it is acquired, so it is not inherited through the genes, and it there are chances of full recovery. So full recovery is possible in case of Sydenham's chorea. So next, coming to the athetosis, slow writhing movements, you are able to see mainly hyperextension of the fingers, and then flexion of the wrist, and the pronation of the forearm. Okay, then followed by the supination of forearm, extension of wrist, and flexion of digits will takes place. Athetosis. So here also lesion in neostriatum, corpus striatum, okay, caudate nucleus and putamen and globus pallidus. Next, balismus is violent bursting movements. So there is no slow writhing or unwanted. Here suddenly violent movements you can take place in the limb, trunk and girdles. Okay, so there are different types. If one half of the body is affected, it is called as hemibalismus, and if only one limb is affected, it is called as monobalism. Okay, so mainly chorea, athetosis and the balismus, you can see lesions of the basal nuclei. Okay, then here in the balismus also there is lesion in the subthalamic nucleus. So next, coming to the third ventricle, it is a narrow slit. You are able to situated within the diencephalon. So in between the two thalamus, you can see it is a narrow slit. So it is actually a cavity of diencephalon. Okay, so it is a cavity of the diencephalon. So anteriorly, what happens, it communicates with the interventricular foramen of Monro. So here you are able to see the interventricular foramen of Monro, through which the lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle. So here you are able to see that is the lateral wall only of the third ventricle. Then posteriorly it communicates with the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so through the cerebral aqueduct it has communications with the fourth ventricle. Okay, so through that it communicates with the fourth ventricle. Okay, so cavity of diencephalon, narrow slit situated in the midline. There is no both like lateral ventricle on either side. You have only one third ventricle in the midline, between the mass of two mass of gray matter on either side. That is your thalamus and the hypothalamus below. thalamus above and hypothalamus below. On either side of the thalamus and hypothalamus, you see the narrow slit called as the third ventricle, which is extending from the interventricular foramen to the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so through the cavity, you can see this interthalamic adhesion, gray matter, passes through this third ventricle and connects the thalamus of the both the sides. Interthalamic adhesion. So coming to the boundaries, mainly your anterior wall. So here you are able to see the anterior wall is mainly formed by your lamina terminalis. So this band of white matter through which the anterior commissure is seen, lamina terminalis, and then mainly your anterior commissure, as I told you. Okay, so upper part anterior commissure, and that is your lamina terminalis, and then more anteriorly the column of fornix. You are able to see, so that is the column of fornix. They all form the anterior wall. Posterior wall is mainly formed by the pineal gland and the habenular nucleus. Okay, so pineal gland and the habenular nucleus with the habenular commissure you can see in the posterior wall. Lateral wall is formed by thalamus above, hypothalamus below, separated by the hypothalamic sulcus. Okay, so that is the lateral wall. Then floor structures. So mainly they also form the floor of the diencephalon. So that is your mammillary body, tuber cinereum with the infundibulum and posterior perforated substance. They all form the floor of the third ventricle. They are also the floor of the diencephalon. Okay. Then coming to the roof. So roof is mainly formed by the ependyma and above the ependyma. So roof cavity is lined by the ependymal cells, and above the ependyma you can see the telechoroidea. So which is your pia mater, double layered fold of pia mater with the choroid plexus, capillary plexus projecting. Okay, that is forming the roof, which extends from your interventricular foramen to the habenular commissure. Okay, so telechoroidea above the ependymal lining. Then certain extensions of the third ventricle you are able to see here. One is your infundibular recess extending into the infundibulum. The other one is the optic recess extending into your optic chiasma. And then you have your pineal recess. So that is your pineal gland, which consists of superior and inferior stalk. Between that you can see the pineal recess. And then above the pineal gland you also have one more recess called as the suprapineal recess. So four recesses are extensions of the cavity: infundibular, optic, pineal and suprapineal recess of the third ventricle. Okay, so the telechoroidea is a double layered fold of pia mater which extends the posterior part of the corpus callosum above fornix anteriorly. So fornix and the posterior part of corpus callosum, and below you have the thalamus. In between these two you have the transverse fissure through which this telechoroidea is actually projecting along with the choroid plexus. So it is somewhat triangular in shape, which has got two lateral parts, two lateral ends and one medial end, midline it projects. So that is your telechoroidea, which is projecting, as I told you, thalamus below and corpus callosum and fornix above. So the laterally it goes to the lateral ventricle, and the midline part in medially it projects into the third ventricle. Okay, so that is about the telechoroidea and the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is mainly formed by the anterior choroidal artery. Okay, so the median part is seen in the roof, which is projecting into the third ventricle. So applied anatomy, so hydrocephalus, if there is actually obstruction of this third ventricle, so naturally you do ventriculography. So air is actually injected into the ventricle, and ventriculography is actually to determine, to diagnose any what do you call, the obstruction of the third ventricle. So with this I have actually completed the basal nuclei and the third ventricle. Thank you very much for your patient listening.